Hey guys, and welcome back to the Spruce and Linen channel. I'm Janelle, and today we're going to talk about couching. This is an embroidery stitch. It's super simple and easy, and it's a great way to add texture and pattern to your weaving. So today I'm going to show you 3 different ways you can use it with 3 different materials. So let's get started. This video is brought to you by the Spruce and Linen shop, where you can find weaving looms, kits, tools, and supplies. Link in the description box below. As I mentioned, we're going to do 3 different stitches, I guess, with the couching in 3 different fibers, just so that we can get a little bit of a broad view of what you can all do with this stitch. Now, you can definitely do pretty much any embroidery stitch on top of your weaving, but we're gonna focus on this one today because I just wanna show you the different ways that you can use it. First, we're going to use a yarn, then we're going to use a cotton rope, and then finally, we're going to use some merino wool roving. I will put links in the description box below for the different materials that I'm using for this project, but let's jump right in. Okay, so the first one we're going to do is sort of this wavy design. Now, I've made myself a little pattern. You definitely don't have to do this, but I just thought it might be helpful. If you just kind of want something to follow, you can certainly draw something out. We're going to be using this stitch today to do pretty much just like linear things, but there's so much more you can do with couching, and you can really go down the Pinterest rabbit hole of different things that you can do with this stitch. You can make pictures with it, and of course, the smaller yarn you use, the more intricate you can get your designs. So this is a really great technique to use when you are wanting to create something a little bit more complex, or just a certain type of texture, but you don't want to actually have to weave it in, you know, and have like a million warp strings just to get in the fine detail that you're looking for. So I'm actually going to be drawing on my weaving for this one. You definitely don't have to do it, but I just wanted to show it to you so that you know that it's an option, especially with couching, because you can then put your yarns right on top of the line and cover it completely up anyway. So in order to do that though, I've made this pattern so that I'm not just willy-nilly drawing on my weaving, just in case I mess it up. So I'm gonna be using this yarn for this kind of wavy design, and I do want to use multiple strands of this, and that's one of the kind of strategies you can use to do this. And I kind of need to figure out where I want to start and stop. So I'm thinking there, I think we're gonna start about here, and I'm just gonna start drawing right on here. And I know this can be a little bit nerve-wracking, so again, you don't have to do this, but especially when you're just practicing, why not try it out? Because you might find that you really like having that design drawn right on there for you. And then I'm going to stop. So I stopped 1, 2, 3, kind of 4 strings in. So I'm gonna stop 4 strings in on this side too, just so we kind of have some balance there. So that should be a good enough little pattern for us to follow. And now all we're going to do is grab this yarn, and this is like a worsted weight yarn. And again, I will add links in the description box below. And we're going to use multiple strands. So I'm just gonna first figure out how many strands I want to do before figuring out the length that I need. Because I want to make it kind of thick, but what's nice about this technique is you could use different strands. So you could use, you know, 3 or 4 different yarns to create a really unique color combination in these strands. To me, that looks pretty good. It might be a little bit thicker than I'm wanting. So maybe I'll just remove 1. Yeah, I'm liking that. So how many strands do we have here? 2, 4, 6, 8. Okay, so I'm gonna be using 8 strands. Now I'm just going to quickly kind of figure out the length that I'm going to need. And of course, I'm going to give myself a decent amount of extra just to be safe. So that looks good to me. And then I'm going to, again, cut 8 strands. I'm also going to cut all these loops so that they are just full-on strands. You don't have to do this, but I just want to get rid of that loop. All right, so now we have our strands there. And I'm going to be using, to do the actual stitching for this couching, I'm going to be using 8/8 cotton. You can find this in my Etsy shop. Again, I'll put a link in the description box. This is just a little bit, it's twice as thick as the other warp string that I carry. And this is literally personal preference. You can also just use yarn to do this. You could use matching yarn if you want it to blend in. You could use colorful yarn, multiple strands of different colors. Literally the possibilities are endless. I'm gonna use this one because it's going to be really, it's going to pop on this, so you're gonna really see what I'm doing. But also just, it's a nice thick, essentially like embroidery thread. So I also have just like a plastic yarn needle here. I'm going to thread this on. And this length, honestly, is probably way too much, but it's just an already cut piece I had, so I wanted to use it up. And then the first thing that we need to do, we need to kind of decide how we're going to start and end. So there's two different methods here. For this one, we're going to leave the tail and just cut it off after. So that's where we have the extra length, which is great. But you could also tuck in those ends if you want to make it sort of look like the yarn is just kind of protruding out of the weaving instead of just sitting on top of it. But for this one, we'll do that later with the merino roving, but for this one, we're gonna just kind of have it on top. So I'm starting, so we're coming from the back with the needle, and leave yourself a tail on the back. You're gonna leave a tail about like that. And then we're simply just going to go back to the back. So again, because I have this Sharpie line, I am working hard to cover that up now. So I'm just going to pick another spot. Now we're going to flip this. And we're just going to literally just tie the end in a knot. Don't pull too hard here because you might kind of like mash up the warp strings and have them kind of tight together. So you don't have to go too tight or anything. Make sure that's nice and tight. So now we're gonna flip this over and we're going to keep going. Now the spacing really for these stitches is up to you, but it kind of depends on what you're doing as well. So if I chose to not do another stitch on top of this until the peak of this little hill, it's gonna end up looking a little bit more like a zigzag than like a curve. So I'm going to do one in between, and I'm just kind of guessing if you want to draw out the stitch marks on your design, and I'll just demonstrate that real quick. So if you wanted to go in and let's say, you know, my next stitch is going to be here and then here and so forth, you can do that. So if you want to make sure that spacing is even, perfectly even, you can do that. I'm just going to kind of eyeball this. So now I'm just literally going to come up, I'm looking at where my line is. I'm going to kind of just pick a spot to come up again through the back. Make sure that you pull that not super tight, but so that there's no loop on the back either. So just like so. And then I'm going to make sure this is covering up my line, and then we're going back through the back again. So when you're using multiple strings, you might have to kind of, like I just did, straighten out the strands of the yarn. So I'm going in again. Now we're kind of at the peak of the curve. And you can see that this is like really a simple process, and it really helps, just like an embroidery hoop. Having your weaving on the loom is keeping everything nice and tight. And so that's going to make your life easier doing this stitch and any other embroidery stitches as well. So again, just coming up through the back, trying to kind of eyeball about the same distance that I had here. Oh, and you know what? That looks to me like, so I'm gonna go back through because I was coming up kind of on the line, and I want to make sure I'm coming up so that the yarn is on the line. So that one looks a little bit wonky. You can see how much of an angle I've got going on, and I'm not a huge fan of that. So I'm just going to unstitch that. And just like on weaving, it's all part of it. You can see I'm stuck on some yarn strings there. So I'm going to kind of look at this again and be like, okay, that looks like about the right spot. So let's try that. And that looks much better. Now in between, I can see that I maybe want this a little bit tighter so that it's really holding everything down. So now that I'm kind of at the bottom of the curve, I'm gonna try to go kind of like basically straight up from that one. Now we're gonna do this later with merino wool roving, but another strategy you can do in this scenario is you can actually like kind of pick up your yarns and have this be more of a loop to create even more texture if you want that. For now, we're just working on the flat just so I can show you a few different ways of doing this. Okay, so we're just gonna continue that process. And as you can see, like it's really simple. It's more about the spacing of it that I'm trying to get somewhat even. Again, I'm not ever striving for perfection because that's usually not as fun. But I can see here, like these are looking fairly evenly spaced. And so I'm happy with that. So now we're gonna flip this over. And all we need to do now is just kind of tie ourselves a knot so that this doesn't come loose. So I'm just using one of those stitched strings to do this. Trying not to pull too tight. Now I've got a knot there, and then I'm just going to, just to keep things tidy back here, I'm just going to literally tuck in this end just how I would any other end. So just down through a couple of the channels of weft strings. And then you can cut off the excess and do the same with the other tail. All right, so now we have that all done, and I'm going to choose to kind of cut off these ends so that they're not kind of going beyond the weaving, just because I think that would look cuter on this particular piece. So you can just cut those off. Oh, trying to get my garbage can. My scraps can, I should call it, not a garbage can. And then same thing on the other side here. Just gonna try to cut them off about the same length as the other side. And that looks pretty good. So there we have one of the methods that you can do with couching. So next we're going to take some cotton rope, and this I believe is a 5mm, but you can use any thickness for this. It just really depends on how much you want that to really stand out. So again, if you used a 7mm and up, it's gonna look more textured. So as I said before, the thicker the yarn or rope or anything that you're putting on here for your couching, the more it's going to provide that texture. So if you want it more subtle, use a thinner yarn. If you want it more of the focal point, you can use a thicker yarn. So for this next one, I want to kind of do these loops. So the reason for this is because you can definitely use couching as a method to add words and letters and numbers to your weaving without having to weave those things in. And again, this is a way to get sort of a more complicated design on a weaving without having to have your warp strings super close together in order to achieve that detail. So what I would like to do here is this, it's just like kind of a loop design here. Again, you can use the marker method to draw on this design, or you can kind of just lay out what you're going for, like I am here. If you're not too particular about it being exact, then you can do it this way. So I'm going to, again, leave myself a decent amount of extra. I just never want to be short. And that looks pretty good to me. So we're going in with our whatever color of choice you want to use to do the couching. And it's going to be essentially the same method, but when we get to these kind of crisscross areas, I think what I'm going to do, and I'm not an embroidery expert, but I'm sure you can kind of do this however you want. So what I'm going to do is actually, I'm going to go up this way and stitch this down. And then when we come back around, I'm going to stitch on top of it again. So I'm hoping what that will do is sort of flatten out this rope a little bit so that when we go back over top of it, it's not like super thick or anything like that. So once again, we're going to start this off exactly the way we started the last section off. So again, I'm kind of starting in a similar area that I did on the last one in terms of how far from the edge I'm going. And you can just repeat the same process from this stitch here to start this off. All right, so now with a rope like this, if you're wanting to keep it more round, you want to keep your stitches close together as you're going around the rope. So if I were to go and stitch it back in way up here, that's not going to look as good than if I go as tight as I can to the rope, like so that it's keeping that rope nice and tight, and it's going to look a little bit more round. Okay, so I just undid that last stitch because I was finding it wasn't really covering the way I wanted it to. So I'm actually going to try to come up through the same exact spot I came up with the previous one. Gonna put that yarn over and come back through. So now I'm just kind of laying this out, kind of trying to figure out how I want the rest of this to go. And again, if you want to keep it ultra simple, I would recommend drawing on this if you're confident enough that you know what you want to do. But I just wanted to kind of show you that you can do it whichever way that you're comfortable with. If you're not comfortable drawing right on your weaving with a Sharpie, then you don't have to do that. Okay, so now we're at the bottom of this curve again, and so I'm going to do the same method I did over here, where I'm going to come up exactly where this string came up and try to go back down in the same spot as well. And then that sort of holds it down. All right, so I'm gonna do one more loop and then we will move on to the merino wool roving. The last thing we're gonna do with this couching technique is we're going to take some merino wool roving and we're gonna create some serious texture. So the first thing I'm going to do is kind of just try to figure out the length I want. So we're gonna kind of be creating these bubbled up areas, and I'm just gonna give myself a healthy piece here. And then I'm going to definitely be splitting it. So this is probably about a third of the actual thickness. And so what I want to do is create these little bubbles like so. But what we're going to do is we're going to add some extra stitching in order to add some extra interest. Something else that's really interesting that you can do with couching, and I'm not going to do it here today, but you can take your stitches and completely cover up the rope or yarn that's underneath. So then you would be left with the outer stitching really being the focal point, so that you could add stripes. You can just make it basically look like a raised area. In this case, I could have used like an off-white rope with off-white stitching and just created like a raised but kind of blending in design with it. Like I said, definitely go over to Pinterest and go down the rabbit hole of couching because there's so many great ideas there. For this last method, I'm going to start it exactly the same way that we did before. But before we actually start stitching, what I would like to do is actually fish the roving back down into the weaving so that it kind of just looks like it's coming right out of our piece. So I'm just kind of pushing the yarns out of the way here to create a bit of a hole so that I can fish that back in there. And I'll go back and tuck that in later. And then we're just gonna start stitching kind of next to it. So I think I want to start my stitching right about here. And for this, starting it again is going to be exactly like the other two methods. So you can go ahead and pull this through and tie a knot on the back. Before you go and pull this tight, this is where we're going to create this little bit of a bubble. So you kind of need to make sure that that bubble is there before you go and tie the knot on the back. So that's looking pretty good to me. So I'm gonna flip this over and tie a knot. And just so we make sure that this little tail doesn't get in our way, I am going to tuck it in right away, just to kind of get this out of the way. All right, so we're flipping this back over. And now what we're going to do is we're going to just keep stitching in the same area and create sort of a wrap, if you will, around the wool. So you can do this as wide and as many stitches as you want. So already I can tell that my stitches aren't very straight, so I'm going to try to straighten them out and go straight above where the last one was. Okay, so now I have a few rows of stitches, I guess, if you will, there. So now we're going to create another little textured area. I'm trying to keep them the same, but you don't have to. Like, you could go kind of random if you want. So again, I'm just going to kind of let that bubble up like so, and then start stitching again over here. So I'm going to keep going with this technique all the way across. Okay, so to finish off this roving, because I used plain weave, I didn't really have a great place to tuck in the roving in the back, so I'm literally just kind of using those embroidery stitch areas to tuck in the roving and cut off the excess. Now ideally this would be a little flatter, but it's still kind of a neat, tidy way to get it all tucked in there. All right, you guys, so that is 3 different ways with 3 different materials that you can add couching to your weaving. As you can see, anywhere from just adding sort of a design element to adding a lot of texture. There's so many things you can do with this, and I'm so excited to see the projects that you create. All right, you guys, I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial, and if you like this video, please hit that like button, subscribe, and click the bell to get notifications when I post new videos. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.